This video is sponsored by Delete Me. Captain First Rank Nikolay Suvorov couldn't ignore the facts. His submarine, K-429, was in dry dock. His usual crew was on leave. The boat was unfit for combat. And yet the order was clear: sail anyway. The Soviet Navy had no room for objections. Hastily, he patched together a skeleton crew, many of whom had never set foot aboard K-429. Neither crew nor boat was ready. But that didn't matter. On the evening of June 23, 1983, Suvorov gave the order to dive. But something was wrong. He hadn't given the command to set the diving watch. Systems weren't aligned. Men weren't at their stations. Still, he pushed forward. Confused, unsure, and under pressure, he gave one final order: flood auxiliary ballast tanks. Then came the panic. The sub, overloaded by more than 60 tons, began to sink. Fast. Suvorov paled. He knew all escape hatches had been welded shut. Worse, he knew what was in the launch tubes. The Soviet Union would desperately try to hide the K-429 incident to avoid humiliation. And yet, not even the second most powerful military in the world could keep its information under wraps. Today, we face a similar issue. Almost nothing about you can stay hidden. Data brokers legally collect and sell personal information. Your name, address, phone number, relatives, even photos, to anyone willing to pay. These people search sites build digital profiles that can expose you to scams, phishing, doxing, and other forms of harassment. Our team at Dark Seas takes privacy seriously, which is why we use Delete Me. It's a hands-free service that removes your personal information from hundreds of data brokers and people search sites. Within a week of signing up, our privacy report showed dozens of listings containing our team members' personal and business data, some dating back years. Delete Me's privacy experts removed it all and continue monitoring year-round to make sure it doesn't return. Delete Me has led this field for over 15 years. They never outsource data handling and even have real privacy advisors who handle custom requests, something we found genuinely useful in cleaning up older listings tied to previous work. If you're concerned about digital exposure, whether you research sensitive topics or just want to protect your family, Delete Me is an essential tool. Visit joindeleteme.com/darkseas today and use promo code DARKSEAS for 20% off all consumer plans, or scan the QR code on screen. The Soviet Navy hid K-429 to maintain control. Today's control begins with knowing where your information is and taking it back. The submarine was plummeting to the abyss in the middle of Saranaya Bay, just south of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. Inside her hull, 8 SSN-9 Siren cruise missiles, each armed with 200-kiloton warheads, nuclear torpedoes in her tubes, enough firepower to erase entire cities. Paralyzed with dread, Suvorov realized his mistake. 4 words he'd failed to say, quote, set the diving watch. 4 words to send men to their stations, to align the submarine's labyrinthine systems for submersion, to check the ventilation valves that gaped open toward the sea. But he never said them. Instead, confusion reigned. Of the 120 men aboard, nearly 40 had never served on K-429. They'd been pulled from other boats, from shore duty, from wherever bodies could be found to fill empty bunks. The shipyard had left the submarine's ventilation system cranked wide open, every valve, every interlock disabled to exhaust welding fumes. The main ballast tank indicators showed empty. But outside the pressure hull, thousands of tons of seawater were already flooding in, dragging K-429 down by her nose. Confused, watching his submarine refuse to settle at periscope depth, Suvorov made things worse by ordering the flooding of ballast tanks. 60 tons. That's how negative the submarine's buoyancy became in seconds. K-429 transformed from submarine to stone, plummeting toward the bottom of Saranaya Bay. The first man to understand they were dying was probably Seaman Anatoly Makota in Compartment 2. He would have heard it first, the thunderous roar of the Pacific Ocean forcing its way through ventilation shafts, never meant to taste salt water. Makota and 13 others in the forward compartments had perhaps 10 seconds to live before 420 cubic meters of ocean crushed them against bulkheads, pressed air from their lungs, and filled their mouths with brine and darkness. In the control room, Suvorov screamed, quote, emergency blow, all ballast tanks. But panic had already infected his operator. Shaking hands reversed the sequence. Instead of opening the valves that would flood high-pressure air into the ballast tanks, he opened the vents on top. Precious air, their only hope of reaching the surface, shrieked uselessly into the sea. Half their emergency reserves were gone in seconds. The depth gauge spun like a slot machine. 20 meters, 25, 30, 35. At 200 meters, the pressure hull would implode. The torpedo firing range, where Suvorov had refused to go without a test dive, where Admiral Yerofeyev had ordered him directly, waited at a depth of 200 meters. Every man aboard would be crushed like insects, their nuclear weapons scattered across the sea floor, another Soviet disaster hidden beneath the waves. But luck had a different plan. At 39 meters, K-429 struck bottom. The impact threw men from their feet, shattered gauges, and sent loose equipment flying through compartments. But the hull held. The reactor, sensing disaster, had already executed an emergency shutdown. The nuclear weapons, cradled in their racks, remained secure. In the forward compartments, where water had first poured, there was silence. 14 men were gone. In the rest of K-429, 106 men breathed recycled air and tried to understand their new reality. They were alive, for now, in an iron coffin on the bottom of the sea. In the aftermath of impact, as emergency lighting cast submarine compartments in hellish red, 106 men took inventory of their new prison. The forward compartments were gone, flooded. Life support was running on battery power that wouldn't last forever. The reactor was shut down, but still radiating heat into a closed system. The temperature was already climbing. The submarine's ventilation system was compromised. It had been designed to cool 9 compartments and was now struggling to manage 6. Heat from the dying reactor core had nowhere to go except into the bodies of trapped men. The air grew thick, oppressive. Men stripped to underwear, then to nothing. Sweat poured off them in rivers, pooling on the deck plates, making every surface slick. In the battery compartments, the temperature hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men took turns pressing themselves against the hull, trying to steal seconds of relief from the cool metal. The batteries themselves posed a new threat, overheating and beginning to release hydrogen gas into the already toxic atmosphere. Then came the explosion. One of the main batteries ruptured. The sound reverberated through the steel hull. Dread rocketed. The explosion meant hydrogen gas was now seeping through the submarine. A hydrogen concentration above 4% would be deadly. One spark, from damaged electrical systems, from static discharge, from any of 1,000 sources, and K-429 would burn from the inside. The submarine had been designed with this type of nightmare scenario in mind. There was a way out. Emergency position buoys that could rocket to the surface and broadcast their location. Escape capsules are designed to carry men to safety. But it was well known to the Soviet Navy that these emergency buoys were welded to the hull, standard practice in the Pacific Fleet. Losing a buoy in rough weather meant court-martial for the captain. Losing men meant only paperwork. The same logic had sealed the escape capsules. Soviet paranoia had welded shut to every exit. They were truly trapped. Still, Suvorov assumed that his report of conducting a test dive had been received at headquarters. Surely, when K-429 failed to surface after an hour, 2 hours, alarms would sound. Ships would come. But as the hours crawled by in the suffocating heat, a terrible possibility took shape. The message had been lost, misfiled, ignored. As far as the Pacific Fleet knew, K-429 was safely moored at her pier, her crew on leave. No one was coming. The realization spread through the submarine like the hydrogen gas itself. They could last perhaps 72 hours on emergency power, less if the hydrogen concentration rose too quickly. Outside, 39 meters above, Pacific waves rolled on. Inside, the temperature continued its relentless climb, and 106 men waited in the red-lit darkness. By the morning of June 25th, they'd been underwater for over 30 hours. The temperature remained unbearable. Someone had to reach the surface. Suvorov called for volunteers. Everyone knew what going meant. The torpedo room escape trunk, their only exit, was designed for emergency ascents in controlled conditions, not for a free swim through 39 meters of frigid Pacific water. With minimal equipment, the men who attempted it would face nitrogen narcosis, decompression sickness, and hypothermia, if they made it to the surface at all. 2 sailors from Suvorov's original crew stepped forward. These were men who knew K-429, who had sailed with her before this disaster, who understood what they were volunteering for. The escape trunk was a vertical steel tube, barely wide enough for a man in diving gear. The procedure was brutal in its simplicity. Flood the chamber, equalize pressure, open the outer hatch, and swim. But first, they had to reach it through the flooded torpedo room. Suvorov would later describe what these men faced. Quote, "You couldn't imagine what it was like to crawl in total darkness in a diving suit through the flooded torpedo section, which is almost 9 meters long and just 53 centimeters wide. Fear starts to fetter your movements, occupy your mind, and suppress your will." In complete darkness, knowing that one snag meant drowning, the men squeezed through, their breathing apparatus hissing. Then came the ascent. No decompression stops, no safety line. Just a desperate climb through black water toward a surface they couldn't see. The cold hit them like a hammer. They broke the surface, gasping, alive against all odds. Yet the horizon offered no salvation, no rescue ships, no search aircraft, nothing but gray waves and distant shore. So they swam, fighting hypothermia with every stroke, until they dragged themselves onto the rocky beaches of Kamchatka. All they had to do was find Soviet officials and sound the alarm. But that's not how the Soviets did business, not in the Cold War. Military police found 2 soaking wet sailors with a fantastic story about a sunken submarine. In the paranoid world of Soviet military security, the obvious explanation was espionage. The sailors were detained, interrogated, and their desperate pleas dismissed as cover stories. Precious hours ticked by as they tried to convince their captors that 106 men were dying beneath the waves. The bureaucratic machinery of the Soviet military was slowly awakened. Forms had to be filed. Stories had to be verified. Chains of command had to be observed. At noon on June 25, 1983, the message finally reached Rear Admiral Oleg Yerofeyev, the same man who had threatened Suvorov's party membership, who had ordered the submarine to sea. Nearly 40 hours after K-429 hit bottom, the Pacific Fleet erupted into motion. Now began a race they were already losing. The mobilization was massive and chaotic. Every available vessel in Petropavlovsk received emergency sortie orders. Rescue ships, salvage vessels, tugboats, anything that could carry divers and equipment. The submarine rescue vessel SS-21 led the flotilla as she built speed towards Saranaya Bay. But finding a submarine on the bottom is not like finding a ship on the surface. K-429 lay silent, giving no signals, no beacons, no sign of life. The rescue ships arrived in the afternoon and began their desperate search pattern. At 7:15 p.m., a sonar operator on SS-21 called out coordinates. A long, metallic return. The right size, the right shape. Divers went over the side immediately, descending through the darkening water toward what they prayed was K-429. The first diver to reach the submarine knocked on the hull. The response from inside was immediate, frantic, and grateful. They had found her. Now they had to get the men out before the submarine became their tomb. The rescue plan was straightforward, but dangerous. Divers would enter through the escape trunks, deliver individual breathing apparatuses to each man, then guide them to the surface. There would be no decompression stops. There wasn't enough time. They would risk the bends, rather than a hydrogen explosion or battery failure. The 7th compartment went first. One by one, sailors locked out through the escape trunk, each ascent a gamble, with nitrogen bubbles in their blood. The divers moved efficiently, checking equipment, and guiding panicked men through procedures they'd only practiced in swimming pools. By 10:36 p.m., the first rescued sailor broke the surface, gasping, alive. Rescue boats converged, pulling men from the water, wrapping them in blankets and counting heads. More came up, a steady stream of survivors rising from the deep. But the sea demanded its price. 2 sailors never made it. Perhaps equipment failure, panic in the darkness, or simply bodies pushed beyond endurance. They drowned within sight of salvation. By 11 p.m., the last sailor reached the surface. The count, 106 men trapped, 104 rescued, 2 lost in ascent. Added to the 14 from the initial flooding, there were 16 fallen sailors. And K-429 lay empty at the bottom of the ocean. The Soviet system demanded blood for failure. Captain First Rank Nikolay Suvorov stood before his judges, knowing the verdict had been written before the first witness spoke. Beside him stood Lukovazov, chief of the fifth compartment, another offering to the machinery of blame. 10 years. That was Suvorov's sentence. 8 for Lukovazov. The charges were violations of fleet rules, but everyone in the courtroom knew the real crime: embarrassing the Soviet Navy. 16 lost sailors, a nuclear submarine on the bottom of Saranaya Bay. It was a scandal. Someone had to pay, and it wouldn't be the admirals who'd ordered an unprepared boat to sea. They were arrested immediately, there in the courtroom. No time for goodbyes. Guards led them away while their wives sat stunned in the gallery, watching their husbands disappear into the Soviet prison system. But Suvorov left them with a warning, quote, "I'm not fully innocent, but a fair analysis should have been made to avoid such accidents in the future. If you do not tell the truth, others do not learn from bad experiences. More accidents will happen. More people will die." His words fell on deaf ears. The Soviet Navy had no interest in truth, only in maintaining the facade of competence. The grotesque theater of blame reached its climax with Admiral Oleg Yerofeyev's fate. The man who had threatened to revoke Suvorov's party membership, who had ordered K-429 to sea against all safety protocols, and who bore ultimate responsibility for the disaster, received a promotion: commander of the Baltic Fleet. The cover-up extended beyond the courtroom. When K-429's original crew returned from leave, they found empty moorings where the submarine should have been. No explanation, no acknowledgement. Their boat had simply vanished, along with 16 of their comrades. They learned the truth only in whispers. The state propaganda machine worked overtime to bury the story. No newspapers carried reports of the sinking. No television broadcasts mentioned the rescue. 16 families buried their loved ones in silence. The graves themselves became classified information, hidden away like shameful secrets. K-429 joined a growing list of maritime catastrophes, known only to those who survived them and those who caused them. But Suvorov had been right about one thing. Without truth, without learning from mistakes, more accidents would happen. They spent 300 million rubles retrieving K-429, her reactor, and nuclear warheads. August 6, 1983. After 40 days of unprecedented salvage operations, 24 ships and 152 divers rushed from across the Soviet Union. K-429 broke the surface again. They towed her to shallow water, then into dry dock, where the real work began. The submarine was a disaster zone. Forward compartments still held the slit of Saranaya Bay. Electronics corroded beyond recognition. The reactor, which had been operating at 0.5% power throughout the disaster, had control rods that jammed before fully inserting and needed a complete overhaul. But the Soviet Navy was nothing if not stubborn. They would rebuild K-429, no matter the cost, no matter the wisdom of breathing life back into a submarine that had already claimed 16 souls. Month after month, K-429 consumed resources like a black hole. New systems, new equipment, new promises that she would sail again. By September 1985, she was 80% restored. Gleaming with fresh paint, her hull patched and strengthened, her systems tested and retested, she sat at her moorings at the repair facility, almost ready to return to service. On September 13, 1985, she would enter naval folklore as proof that some vessels are simply damned. K-429 sank again. Not in the deep ocean, not during combat operations, not even during a dive. She sank at the pier, tied to the dock. The official reports called the cause hazy. Worker negligence, they suggested. Perhaps a valve was left open. Perhaps it was a seal that failed. A single worker who couldn't escape in time added his name to K-429's growing roster of victims. Submariners whispered of a cursed boat, a submarine that wanted to be on the bottom, that would find any excuse to return there. The second sinking broke even the Soviet Navy's monumental stubbornness. K-429 was raised once more, the costs now astronomical, but this time there would be no resurrection. They gutted her, stripped her of anything valuable, and converted her hollow shell into a training hulk. A floating classroom where future submariners could learn their trade. It was the perfect Soviet solution. Waste nothing, admit nothing, learn nothing. K-429 wasn't unique in her tragedy. Throughout the Cold War, Soviet submarines sank with haunting regularity. S-80 in 1961 with 68 lost sailors, K-8 in 1970 with 52, K-219 in 1986, 4 more, and K-278 comme Sommelets in 1989 with 42 dead. The pattern was always the same: impossible orders, inadequate resources, and inevitably, deceased sailors. When Rear Admiral Yurafayev threatened Suvorov's Communist Party membership, effectively ending his career if he refused to sail, he was merely following the Soviet Navy playbook. Challenge orders, lose your commission. Question safety, face a tribunal. The system didn't want officers who thought. It wanted officers who obeyed. This was the fundamental madness of the Soviet submarine force, trying to match the US Navy with second-rate technology, third-rate maintenance, and a system that punished truth more severely than failure. American submarines operated with redundant safety systems, professional volunteer crews, and a culture that encouraged reporting problems. Soviet submarines sailed with welded escape hatches, conscripted sailors who'd never seen the ocean, and a culture where reporting problems meant the gulag. If you want to take control of your personal data and keep it out of the hands of data brokers, visit joindeleteme.com/darkseas and use promo code DARKSEAS for 20% off. Secrecy doesn't just belong to governments. In the digital age, it's something we should all claim.